What's up guys, Paladin Crossrider here, and today I've got my Eradicator deck profile for you guys. I've really been enjoying this deck lately. I'd say besides Gear Chronicle, this is the second favorite deck of mine. So I've been putting in a good amount of time trying to figure out what I like with this deck. So let's get started. And before I start, I'm gonna say if you haven't followed my Twitter account, make sure you do, because I ran a poll on what deck profile you guys wanted to see. And this time Eradicator's won, so if you aren't following and there are certain deck profiles you wish to see, make sure you give me a follow over on Twitter. So anyway, let's get started. We've got one V starter. Not much to say about these anymore. You kind of know why they're good if you've been playing the game already. So then for triggers, we got 4 of the Stride crit and 3 move to soul crit. I like the Stride crit because you do have to have your Stride ready in this deck. If you don't, then some turns you just kind of sit there twiddling your thumbs, not doing too much. So having the Stride crit lets you more consistently stride. And then 3 move to soul, because sometimes you do run out of soul and you need the resource back. So really good. Recommend running 7 crits total. And then I run 4 D-Series front triggers. I really like these in this deck. I like using less cards to guard, and this is just one of those where later in the game you can throw down 20k shield for 1 unit that needs it, rather than throwing a 15k and a 10k unit, which is overguarding. So having this in the deck is really good. Saw someone who was running it and I thought I'd give it a shot, so I'd recommend this. And if you're not a fan of them, you can always run the draw PGs. Then 4 heal guardians. This is essential for this deck. You don't have an early game, so you really need to rely on these early on to survive against decks that are able to push, or decks that are able to apply crits on their grade 3 turn when you're going second. So I cannot recommend these enough. They have saved my butt in a couple games already, so make sure if you build this deck you get these 4 cards. And then 1 over trigger, and it's the Dragon Empire one. Not much to say. A secondary Vanguard attack is just always good. You're not getting it with your strides too often because you run Stunverse in this deck, but you're still able to pull off 2 drive checks each with twin drive if you hit this, so really good. Don't recommend the trial deck one just because of how good that one is. And for grade 1s, I've got 4 Anastasia. She is not an Eradicator, which is the only downside of her. But on Thunderstrike 4, whenever she leaves the guard circle and is retired from there, you draw a card, so it just gets you the card that you discard for her back to your hand in the form of a draw. So I would recommend giving this a shot. I know not having the Eradicator name with certain cards is bad because you need to counterblast in the damage zone for them, but it's not too much, and this card lets you be a lot more bulky in the late game. Then 4 Eradicator Demolition Dragon. This grade 1 is fantastic, and I can't recommend it enough. It's Vanguard Rearguard. When you swing with it and you hit, you can draw a card, and then choose a card in your opponent's drop zone and bind it. And if it's on Rearguard and you chose to bind one of your opponent's cards in the drop zone, you can move it to, or you have to move it to soul. So it's really, really good because you can use it in a lot of situations in a different ways. It's a good attacker or booster. And if you use it on the Rearguard and you draw a card but you don't want to bind any of your opponent's cards, you can choose not to and then keep this on the board as a constant on-hit pressure. So it's really good, and I can't imagine running less than 4 at this point. Finally, for the last grade 1, run 4 Nusku. Nusku, I don't understand why they made this at the time they did, but I'm glad they did. It's like a grade 3 searcher, but instead of checking top 5 for grade 3, you check it for any Eradicator, and if you add an Eradicator, you discard a card. So this lets you go through your deck pretty fast, find whatever pieces you might need during your turn to push your opponent better, and it's really good. But one thing I want to say though, if you don't like running the perfect guards, the Anastasias, and you want to run draw PGs instead of the fronts, go ahead and pick up this card. It's Eradicator Caster. He's just a pretty good stride fodder. Has its bonus effect too, which is solid, but I choose not to run it because I like having the shield value in this deck. The 5k shield kind of hurts more than it helps. Then for grade 0s, I've got 3 Unruly Dragon. If you paid attention to any of the bro results online, you probably saw this card coming. Tested it myself after I got a few. It's a really, really good interceptor for the deck. Lets you punish your opponent if they don't play around this. So forces them to commit attacks or use skills to retire this over other pieces you have on board. And this is the one card where it requires an Eradicator Counterblast, which is why having Anastasia and the damage kind of stinks, but it's only one Counterblast. But if you use this and you snipe an opponent's card on board, you can combine it with another skill that I'll show very soon, and you can disrupt your opponent's board during their turn. And next I got 2 Spark Rain Dragon. I kind of am back and forth with this guy. Sometimes I playtest him and I like him. Sometimes I playtest him and I don't. It really depends on the matchup. So, but if I don't play him, there's a few cards I try instead. Zoiton, so you can swing with him. If your opponent doesn't have a front row, you can move him to soul and draw a card. So he kind of refuels your resources and lets you keep your hand so you can guard against your opponent better. And then Zuhil, you can run this. It's kind of an okay card. I don't really like it just because its skill comes up more in the late game and doesn't do anything for you too early. But the upside is instead of counterblasting or soul blasting, you use a discard for its skill and then you draw a card back. So you can use it to bind your opponent's stuff without you losing resources. So, and the last one is Spark Raise Dragon. This has a Vanguard skill, kind of like the grade 1, where you check top 5, added an Eradicator when it's placed, and then you discard a card if you added one. But it also has some on-hit pressure, where you can Soul Blast and draw a card if it hits a Vanguard. So this is kind of your flex spot, and these are the cards I recommend if you don't like running Spark Rain Dragon. So, but you do have 2 flex spots there. And then run 4 Cohen Shack. This is the card that kind of goes with Unruly Dragon and some of the G guards, where when a card is retired on your opponent's side of the board, you can use this skill once per turn, where your opponent chooses another card and retires it. So it's not used with anything during your turn because your stuff just binds it, it doesn't retire. But if you intercept with Unruly, or like I said, the G guards, you use them, they all retire. So this just allows you to snipe an additional card on your opponent's board. So it allows for more of a board disrupt during their turn. And then for Cho-Oh, I did have the 4th Unruly Dragon in here over this, but I really prefer this card just because it's not locked to having that Eradicator Counterblast restriction. It allows you to multi-attack with its skill. After your Vanguard attacks, you use CB1, restand it, so you can apply crits to it, and yeah, just have an additional attack with pretty big power. Or if you use Vowing Sword skill and you can apply all the numbers there, then you have 2 attacks at big numbers late game. So, and it also allows you to snipe a card in your opponent's front row for a counterblast and then move the back row forward. So it's got a lot of utility to it. And then lastly, the grade 3s. For Vowing Sword, this guy is your main bread and butter of the deck. You go into this, And then for the rest of the game, whenever he's on your Vanguard circle and your opponent had cards bound, you can use his skill to force them to bind more cards from the deck. If they do, then you give units 5k power, but if they don't, you give them an additional 10k power instead. So it lets you, with Stunverse, just get boards to become really massive, really fast. Cho-Oh can become a huge threat when you combine the two together. So you want to run 4 because you have to ride this every time, because your backup grade 3 is Dragonic Descendant. Like I said, you ride this first. The game becomes a whole lot tougher. You don't really get the power on your board like you would with Vowing Sword. However, if you go and ride this after Vowing Sword, you can combine this and Vowing Sword skills together to make a huge board with freestanding potential on the Vanguard. And if you use Stunverse and Stride over Descendant when it gained Vowing Sword skill, and then use Stunverse to go back, the way Descendant is worded, you will keep the skill of the card he wrote over. So you can bind 4 cards with Stunverse, give Vowing Sword's effect, apply the power around the board, and then use Descendant's skill to restand him if his attack doesn't hit. So he makes Vowing Sword very threatening, and if you don't ride him, he's got a rearguard skill as well. You use Soul Blast and combine the unit in your opponent's front row and then move their back row forward. So when your opponent has a full board, you can use that skill in order to get all 5 units off the board if they're playing a non-Excel deck. I do have some suggestions. If you don't like Descendants or don't like Vowing Sword, you can always go back and play Gauntlet Buster. I just don't feel like Gauntlet Buster is good right now. A lot of people are going to guard Vanguard attacks in the premium format, so Gauntlet Buster can't hit easily here. However, if you like the idea of just binding your opponent's front row consistently, it's pretty good. Just don't play it expecting to hit with the multiple crits that it can have. And another card, not a card used on the Vanguard circle, but more on the Rearguard circle, is Sigma. So you can use its GB1 skill, Counterblast, you discard a card, and then you can restand him at the end of the battle. His attack doesn't hit. So if you want something like another Cho-Oh in deck, like a 5th Cho-Oh, you can run one of these and cut another card from the deck. It's just another option that you have in this deck to play. Finally, for the G-Zone, I've got 3 Stunverse Dragon. You don't need 4. There is never a situation that comes up that requires you to have the 4th one. It's only there if you want to unflip that over some other stuff like Vanquishers, but I recommend running 3. I feel like it's the proper amount to run in this deck. Then 2 V-Buster. Sometimes you can't go into Stunverse because your opponent doesn't have enough in Drop Zone or Field, and you won't get an additional draw off of it, which gives you a minus then. So you want to stride into this when your opponent doesn't give you enough resources to bind. That way you still get triple drive, and you can still bind a couple of their things before Stunverse comes out. So pretty good card. 2 is the right amount. Don't need any more than that. Next, I got 2 Voltage. This is used just to finish up the game. Its GB3 skill is the most relevant part about it. For each card in your opponent's bind zone, your front row will get 3k. So later in the game, after 1 or 2 Stunverse turns, if you don't have your GB8 ready, you go into this and you can just make your front row massive. Swing with them and just wrap up the game from there. So 2 I think is the right amount. I wouldn't run 4. 4 just seems like you're running too much and you're expecting to play it for multiple turns when you shouldn't. Then 1 VMAX. I don't go into him often. He's only here during those games when your opponent doesn't have a board out and you can just kind of steal the game with a free damage pane. But if you unflip your other Vanquishers, you can use him to attack their entire board. or as many units as you need to attack with however many you have face up. So it's a good card, but I just don't ever really go into it. So 1GB8, this card, if you ever have to go into it and you plop this down on the board, you can say good game to your opponent, because he will retire both of your fields, bind both of your drop zones, and then every unit on your board will get plus 2,000 power for each card in both players' bind zones. So if you have 25 cards in your bind zone and your opponent has 25 cards in their bind zone, you are going to get an additional 100,000 onto all of your units. And those are numbers that it's either PG or die. There's no question about that. So this guy, you go into it if you can establish a board after retiring yours, and he will win the game. And then I run one Progenitor Dragon. This guy is kind of there if like you don't want to go Stunverse, but yet you want to like get rid of your opponent's field or add a bunch of pressure. Lets you CB2, Soul Blast 1, get 10,000 power, and then when he attacks, he battles all of your opponent's units in one attack. And they have to guard each one individually, but if an attack hits, you get to countercharge one. So you swing with this, and then you hope you hit 2 cards, and if it does, you get to countercharge what you spent on this. So really good card. And also, if this is your first stride, then the rest of the game your strides are free. You don't have to pay the cost for them. So really good. So for G-Guards, got one Dismal. This is to keep that Cho-Oh safe in case I have a hand that is lacking a couple units to reestablish a board in case I am afraid of losing mine. So I play this and keep the Cho-Oh alive for next turn, or whatever unit needs to stay alive on rearguard circle. One Brahma, because if you rode up to grade 3 first, this is the only G-Guard, aside from Dismal, that has a real effect to use. If you have to use this, it's a good 25k shield, but you lose 2 cards from your drop zone, which isn't a bad cost at all, especially if you get into a game where you manage to hit GB8. So, 2 Bulwark Dragon. This is your late game G-Guard. Thunderstrike 3, it gets 10,000 shield. And then when it leaves the guard circle, for every 4 units in your opponent's bind zone, you choose one of their rested units and retire it. So, pretty good board disruption. It's good against decks that restand after the battle, so you can snipe the rear guards that need to go away. And since it retires the unit, you can combine it with a grade 2 in order to snipe an additional rear guard off the board, so pretty good. And then lastly, 2 Impede Dragon. This is your unflipping G-Guard. When you do that, you choose an opponent's unit on their board, you retire it and bind it. And then if you have less rear guards than your opponent by 2 or more, then you choose an additional rear guard and retire it. So the first unit's retired and bound, and the second one's retired, so it sets up for another Stunverse Dragon. Once again, just like Bulwark, you combine it with a grade 2, and you can retire an additional card off the board. So with this one, you have the ability to retire up to 3 cards at once, and it's pretty solid. I would definitely recommend running 2 of these. So that's it for my deck profile, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. This deck, it's pretty good. Against my friends, I've had trouble piloting it myself, but I understand I make some misplays here and there. But I would recommend this deck if you need like a kind of rogue pick for the meta. It's definitely an interesting one. It can help check some Granblue decks if they're not running Bell from the D series to put their bind zone back. Yeah, the power you can put out with Vowing Sword in this build is just absurd. So if you enjoyed the deck profile, make sure you like this video, leave a comment if you have any questions, and subscribe to the channel if you aren't already. I will see you guys with another deck profile very soon.